What happens if spouses separate? The relationship is over, but one spouse refuses to move out. There can be a lot of tension, maybe even violence because of the bad feelings and conflict in the home. Nobody wants to keep living with an ex, but as I covered in episode 91, moving out can cause legal problems, so a spouse may want to stay in the house. So when can one spouse just toss the other one out? That's the topic of this episode of the Ontario Family Law Podcast. I'm Ben Schuman, a certified specialist in family law in Ontario with extensive experience assisting clients with high or complex incomes. I'm also a mediator, arbitrator, and collaborative lawyer. I have a best-selling book, The Guide to the Basics of Ontario Family Law. The new 5th edition has updated information on all common family law issues and lots of information about property rights, homes, and domestic violence. It is available on the iBookstore, Amazon, and in fine bookstores. Whether you can legally throw your ex out of the home depends on a few important factors. It may be allowed, or it may get you into deep trouble. So let's go over those factors. First, it makes a big difference whether the spouses are married or common law. Married spouses have an equal right to stay in the matrimonial home. One married spouse cannot throw the other spouse out without a court order or unless that spouse agrees to go. There are specific criteria that a judge has to consider in deciding whether to order a married spouse out of the home. They include considerations related to any children and the availability of alternate accommodations for each spouse, the financial circumstances of each spouse, and whether there was a written agreement that one spouse would leave. Also, the judge considers any incidents of domestic violence. So if you need to get your married spouse out of the house when he or she refuses to go, speak to a good family lawyer. Common law spouses are not married, and so they do not have a matrimonial home. So being in a relationship does not mean that a spouse gets to stay in the house. However, this is a distinction that many police officers get wrong. So calling the police to remove someone from the premises may not work if the police officer wrongly believes a common law spouse can stay. If you can't just change the locks when your common law spouse is out, you may need to speak to a lawyer. In episode 80, we covered what to do with your ex's stuff once you get them out. However, if common law spouses are both entitled to the home, then they are both owners and they are both allowed to be in it. In that case, the police officer would be right in saying that one owner cannot force the other one out without a court order. There is also no right for one co-owner to buy out the other's interest in a home or other jointly owned property. Under the Partition Act, the judge has to order the property sold on the open market, but both spouses can bid on it. But where one common law spouse owns the home, he or she can insist that the other spouse leave and take his or her stuff. There's a trick that some common law spouses use to try to stay in a home when they are not entitled. That is to claim that regardless of what legal title says, that spouse has a beneficial or equitable ownership interest in the house. That spouse claims to be an owner regardless of what the title says. A common law spouse or anyone else can claim to be a joint owner of a piece of property because the other spouse, the owner, said in writing that the property really belonged to both of them, or because the non-titled spouse put a lot of money or their own labor into the property in the belief that the spouses were going to treat the home as jointly owned. These are complicated claims to make. I touched on them a bit in episode 48. I also covered it in detail in my book starting at page 164. But to understand them fully, you really need to have them explained to you by a good lawyer who can also tell you whether this type of claim applies in your situation. I should also mention that these claims can be very expensive to make. But once the spouse has put the claim to be a joint owner of a piece of property before the court, it's difficult to get him or her out until the court decides the issue. The police will not jump in to substitute their decision for what a judge might do, so it can be hard to get that spouse out. So in a common law relationship, if you own the home, then you may just want to change the locks as soon as your ex leaves and put his or her stuff in storage and send him or her a key before he or she can make a claim in court that allows him or her to stay. If you found this episode helpful or informative, remember there are about 100 more on other family law topics. So please subscribe to keep up to date. Like this podcast as it helps us make more, and hit the notification bell so you know as soon as new episodes come out. Also, please comment on this episode to keep the conversation going. It also helps me select new topics for future episodes. If you rent your home, then you have to keep in mind that these rules apply between spouses and do not apply to landlords. So just because both married spouses are equally entitled to stay in the matrimony home, that does not mean that a landlord cannot evict them for failing to pay rent. If both common law spouses are on the lease, then it may be difficult to get one out, especially if the landlord wants that spouse on the lease to collect the rent. But if only one common law spouse is on the lease, then the other one has no legal right to stay. Some spouses try to circumvent all these rules by calling the police and alleging family violence. If the spouse is arrested for assault or a similar crime, then the terms of release often prohibit that spouse from going back to the home, even if he or she owns it. This actually happens a lot. By all means, if you're in danger, then call the police. But keep in mind that family court judges have seen this used as a tactic many times. They are very suspicious of it. If a judge decides the spouse made up the allegations, the consequences can be dire. A complete loss of credibility, perhaps much less parenting time if the kids were affected, and even financial compensation through spousal support or other types of orders. Making up allegations of family violence and using the police as puppets is a scourge in family courts. It is a great disservice to actual victims of family violence because judges, after hearing many false allegations, are less inclined to believe the real ones, and that puts vulnerable spouses and children at risk. A spouse who makes up allegations of family violence to get possession of a home may have the blood of spouses and children in dangerous and abusive relationships on his or her hands. There are times when you can just throw your ex out of your home, and times when you cannot. So remember, if you want your ex out of the house, but you are married, you need a court order or a written agreement. So you need to speak to a lawyer. If you are living common law and you and your ex own the home together, or your ex has started a court proceeding claiming you should own the home together, then you will need a court order or a written agreement to get him or her out. So you need to speak to a lawyer. If you are living common law and you are the sole owner of the home, then to avoid a big fight and perhaps a police officer who doesn't understand family law, wait until your ex has gone out, change the locks, and put his or her stuff safely in storage. To find out what else you need to do after separating, check out episode 79. And if you are in a difficult situation with your spouse, or you are finding family or children's law confusing or difficult, or you just need to understand it better, or if you need to know how best to make parenting work after separation, or if you need to understand how finances work during a marriage or a common law relationship and after separation or divorce, get the latest edition of my best-selling book, Guide to the Basics of Ontario Family Law. You can access it immediately on the iBookstore or on Amazon for the Kindle version. Amazon can also deliver the paperback version directly to your doorstep. You can also get a lot more Ontario family law information on www.schumanlaw.ca. Not only are there hundreds of pages of family law information and links, but there are links to get my book and links to reach my office to meet with either me or one of my colleagues. You can also contact us to make an appointment to speak to us using the contact information below and in the description. It is always best to get a lawyer who can give you expert advice that's specific to your situation. In addition to my website, keep up to date on family and children's law issues by liking my Facebook page, following me on Twitter or X and Mastodon at @SchumanFamLaw, and finding me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Threads. Of course, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to keep up to date. You get the audio versions of the Ontario Family Law podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and many more. Or you can get all the episodes at www.schumanlaw.ca. Just look for podcasts in the drop-down menu. Thanks for participating in this podcast. We will get together again soon.